Okay, so this video will talk through comparing the poems Search for My Tongue and Poem at 39. If you are one of my students, then you have just sat this question for a mock paper um, for question 2 in English Literature paper 1. So some examiner feedback for you. These were the highlights that examiners in general found. Many identified the change from negative memories to positive ones in poem at 39. And many explained how both poems highlight how resilient memories can be and how basically they can stick with you. Overall, a good exploration of language for both poems. I see that every time as well. We're always very good at analysing language. Stronger responses picked up on tone in both poems. Remember to consider the tone. We'll look at that in a moment. More capable students were able to contrast how memories are expressed in each poem as well. And then areas for development. Some candidates provided separate paragraphs on each poem, then ended with a final paragraph comparing them. And this isn't going to allow for sufficient comparison. And I know we've gone through this so many times. It's not just about knowing both poems really well. It's also how you structure your response to ensure that you are actually comparing them. The question is asking you to compare them. And as you can hopefully see from the packet that I've given you through the mark scheme, that's a big part of the mark scheme. You have to be able to compare and contrast. Candidates that try to compare sentence by sentence often became muddled and forced. So we're going to have a look at how I advise you structure each paragraph in just a moment. Phonetic version of Gujarati was rarely explored by candidates, which is interesting since that's such a big part of Search for My Tongue, and you would get marked down there for your understanding of the poem as well, because you're skipping such an important part of the poem. So it's important, if you do use Search for My Tongue in an answer, that you are considering why or the effect of the use of Gujarati. Failure to link imagery to anguish experienced by the poet in Search for My Tongue. And more discussion, I feel like I say this quite a lot, more discussion on structure and form is needed. I think we have to make a conscious effort to ensure that we're including structure and form, because you will get marked down harshly if you don't analyse either one. So just giving you some ideas. This is by no means all of the things that you could have said, but some ideas of what you could have analysed for each poem, and these give you an opportunity to talk about language, form and structure. So in Search for My Tongue, you could have talked about the direct address. Just a reminder that this question is about memories. So think about how the poet is willing to share her memory with the reader. She wants to share that experience through the use of direct address. She wants to engage the reader in her experience. We have the extended metaphor of the mother tongue, a flower in bud waiting to blossom. So we've got this this idea of an identity being kind of deeply rooted like a plant, and that's all the way through the poem, hence why it's an extended metaphor. Repetition and harsh consonant sounds, for instance, spit it out, shows that anguish and discomfort. That was one thing that the examiner said wasn't really explored with this poem. Contrast in language, for instance, mother and alien, emphasises the great sense of loss. For the poet, that she feels like she's lost her mother tongue, something that should be deeply connected with her and her identity. The phonetic version of Gujarati, you might say, shares her, is the poet showing that she wants to share her language with the reader, and it gives, but also a sense of pride as well. She wants to share it, she wants to show it off. You could also talk about how Gujarati disturbs the poem almost halfway through, which shows how strong her language is, how deeply embedded it is in her, and it hasn't died as she thinks it has. Second stanza disrupts the first stanza, indicated by a volta but. So this is kind of what I've just said. The presence of Gujarati in the second stanza visualises its strength and permanence. So now we're looking at kind of of form and structure. Contrast in tone from first to third stanza. So this poet goes from feeling despair to eventually celebrating the return of her mother tongue. And it's written in free verse, which shows this sense, or maybe you could argue reflects this sense that she's out of control, or the kind of unpredictability of her mother tongue. Okay, poem at 39. Poem is divided into past and present. Her memories encourage her to reflect on her accomplishments and how they link to her father. It starts with a regretful tone, I wish, but ends with a much more celebratory tone, he would have grown to admire. So remember, you don't have to always pick out individual words. Just looking at the shift in tone from the beginning of a poem to the end, you're getting a tick there, not just for tone, but also for structure as well, because you're really thinking about how the poem develops. Use of personal pronouns, or the first person narrative, is her sharing of personal feelings and memories. The enjambment represents a flow of memory, but it could also represent how she struggles to express herself when it's difficult to, especially at the beginning of the poem, when it feels quite regretful and difficult to remember. Violent diction, for instance, beating. She looks back with honesty. Her father was strict and suggests they sometimes clashed. You might talk about the effect of the reader there, that does it give her credibility? She's sharing really personal memories, and they're not all nice, shiny memories. She's really quite honest in her writing. Listing in final stanza indicates her independence and sense of pride. So we've got structure there. And the fire right at the end symbolises the memory of her father living on, you might argue. There are definitely other interpretations of that. So here are some suggested points of comparison. I always mention this because I think this is where students tend to go wrong. Don't force contrasts, or don't force similarities. Keep it simple. I feel like sometimes we try and put a comparison together and they're two completely different things. So you want to really think about in how they are similar or different. So even though these say both, actually sometimes it shows a contrast still. So both poems are about memories. So Search for My Tongue considers how a person can hold on to the memory of a language, and Poem at 39 is about the memory of a father who has passed. So they're different memories, but they are about kind of holding on to memories. Both have a theme of loss. Search for My Tongue fears she has lost her mother language, while I've put pant there instead of PATN. Poem at 39 has lost her father. Both poems grow in strength, while Search for My Tongue shows a stronger grasp on the memory of her language by the end of the poem. Poem at 39 finds strength in her father's memory and reflecting on the woman she has become. Both poems are personal memories. Search for My Tongue hopes to share her experience with the reader to help them understand her experience, and Poem at 39 shows an openness with the reader in even sharing negative memories of her father. Both poems gain a sense of identity through memories, while Search for My Tongue relates her identity to her language. Poem at 39 relates her identity to her father. So what you'll notice is that the points of comparison are fairly vague, and then you can kind of zoom in a little further and talk about kind of the differences within that. But this is basically how you want to start your paragraphs. And I'll give you an example here. You don't have to choose all of these points of comparison either, and of course you could have your own points of comparison. This is just one way of structuring your answer. There are definitely other ways, and you've got to figure out what works for you. But comparative writing is so important, not just for GCSE, but regardless of what you're moving on to, whether it be A-level, IB. Well, I'm teaching IB at the moment. I know comparative writing is really important, or whatever it is you're moving on to. It's a higher writing skill, and it's really, really important that you kind of hone in on that skill now so you're not struggling later on. This is one way of comparing, and I personally find when students use this, they tend to do better. Not always, though. Sometimes students have found their own kind of flair and way to organise their writing, and that works well for them as well. But this is just one example. So I would argue you start with a comparative statement. So what we were just going through there, I'm basically chosen one. So both poems eventually reveal a sense of comfort derived from memory. So that's the comparative statement. That's how I'm bringing both poems together. The speaker in Search for My Tongue finds comfort in reclaiming her language, while the speaker in Poem at 39 finds comfort in the way her memories have shaped her. So then I explain, well, how is that true for both poems? Now, what you'll notice is I'm just going to focus on the analysis of poem 1, so my analysis isn't confused. Okay, so I'm just now focusing on poem 1. The celebratory tone in the third stanza in Search for My Tongue directly contrasts to the anguish and despair evident at the beginning of the poem when she thinks she has forgotten her first language. The floral imagery used to describe the tongue as a bud that blossoms creates a hopeful tone, as well as depicts the return of her mother tongue as a beautiful experience. So the analysis is focused on how she has found comfort. Okay, and she's found comfort through the floral imagery. Okay, and it's also talked about the contrast of how in the third stanza the tone is celebratory, whereas in the first stanza it was much more anguished. Okay, so we've got contrast in tone, and we've talked about floral imagery. So I'm already ticking off structure and language. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the analysis of poem 2. So if you look from here, oh, I think I left a bit out, didn't I? Moreover, the repetition of the verb grow symbolises that her mother tongue is still very much alive, which brings great relief to the speaker. So I've also talked about repetition structure again, but it's also focusing on the use of language. Okay. Likewise, so now we're moving on to analysis of poem 2. There is a clear change in tone from the beginning of poem at 39 to the final 2 stanzas from regret to celebration. So notice when I introduce the second poem, I'm using a comparative word likewise, and that's going to give me a tick because it shows that I'm comparing the poems throughout, but I'm doing it in an organised way so I'm not getting confused between the two. So it's really clear that I've moved on to poem 2, but I've made it clear why this links to the first poem by starting with a comparative word. The internal rhyme of look and cook highlights the similarities the speaker now sees between her and her father, and the list of activities that follow also draws parallels between her father's actions and her own. The poem ends with her symbolically staring into the fire, which could be interpreted as the sense of warmth and comfort her memories provide her with. So this all focuses on where she gets her sense of comfort from. And we've talked about internal rhyme, we've talked about listing, and we've talked about symbolism. So here we've got language and structure as well. It does mean in another paragraph I would have to make sure I talk about form. So I might talk about free verse, for instance. Both poets clearly find happiness in remembering something or someone that is closely linked to their identity. And then I'm linking it back to the topic sentence. And that makes sure, again, that I'm continually comparing. You might want to take some time to read through that and really look at how that's structured. That's just one way, but that's what I think works well. You start with a comparative statement, so you're telling the examiner, I'm comparing these 2 poems. You analyse the first poem, you analyse the second poem. Make sure when you start the analysis of the second poem, you start with a comparative word like likewise, similarly, in contrast. And then for the final sentence, link the poems again, so you're continually comparing and linking it back to the topic sentence to make sure that you're still answering the question and staying focused.